We shouldn't take immersive sims for granted, even the bad ones. These games are so difficult to design and produce that it's honestly a miracle that they're being made in the first place. The two tenets of immersive sims are choice and reactivity. To make these two elements possible, immersive sims use highly complex simulated systems which, combined with the tools and abilities provided by the game, create the illusion of an environment that reacts naturally to player actions. Additionally, the best immersive sims support emergent gameplay. These are situations that, well, emerge from the interaction between simple mechanics that the devs hadn't accounted for when designing the game. Believe it or not, this doesn't even scratch the surface of how difficult these games are to create. Because immersive sims allow for multiple approaches, they typically incorporate elements from multiple genres, like first-person shooters, RPGs, and so on. To prevent overwhelming the player and the game collapsing under the weight of its many systems, these mechanics have to be neatly spaced out, both physically in the game world and design-wise. How? By designing the game with a lot of redundancy in mind. However, designing around redundancy is much harder than it sounds, because it basically involves creating huge game spaces that support a variety of approaches. It's a logistical nightmare. You need to provide vents, sewers, and back alleys for sneaky players, balconies and platforms to scope targets from a distance, assuming the game has vertical level design. How do you open doors? With codes, keys, lockpicks? Can you destroy the doors? Assuming none of those options are available to the player, are there other ways to access that area? Say by taking a vent or double jumping on the roof and opening a hatch. Additionally, designers need to populate these huge spaces with tools, items, and environmental storytelling elements like art assets and reading materials. Assets, levels, and mechanics that many players will not even get to experience depending on their playstyle. The best part is that immersive sims come together only towards the final stretch of development. Now, imagine pitching this to an investor or publisher. Yeah, so we're making this super complex game, but you can't really play it until the last few months of development because it doesn't actually work. And yet, despite all of these obstacles, there are studios out there that make these games. One of those games is Dishonored 2, the sequel to what I consider one of the greatest artistic achievements this medium has ever seen. While Dishonored 2 doesn't reach the heights of its predecessor, I do think it comes as close as something could to the mastery of Dishonored. It's Dishonored, but bigger and more ambitious. Bigger levels, deeper environmental storytelling, even more options to solve problems creatively. Those things, in combination with some of the most intelligent level design this industry has ever seen, makes Dishonored 2 everything an immersive sim fan could wish for. I am in absolute awe of what Arkane achieved with Dishonored 2, and I'm so excited to talk about it today. So in this video I will do exactly that. A deep dive into Dishonored 2's gameplay, design, and immersive mechanics. Just the main game for now. I have played and recorded a bunch of footage of its expansion pack, The Death of the Outsider, but I honestly don't have anything interesting to say about it. For now. Before we go in, I have a Twitter where and a Patreon where you can support the channel with real life money. Let's go!
Hello, old friend.
Dishonored 2 kicks off 15 years after Corvo Attano restored Emily Kaldwin to the throne. While Dunwall has prospered under the young Empress's rule, notice the lack of a rat plague and Dunwall's transition from an early to late Victorian era, Emily herself is not necessarily popular with the general public. Complicating things is a serial killer called the Crown Killer, who has been murdering Emily's political rivals, leading the public to believe that Emily and Corvo are responsible. Anyways, during a ceremony in remembrance of Jessamine Colwyn's assassination, Duke Luca Abel arrives with Delilah Copperspoon, the witch and DLC lady that Dowd trapped in a magical painting of her own creation. The Duke's forces attack, killing Emily's guards, after which the player chooses whether to dishonor Emily or Corvo. The character not dishonored, in my case Emily, is turned to stone by Delilah, while the dishonored character, in my case Corvo, is imprisoned. The player escapes through the docks, where he meets Megan Foster, a ship captain with a mysterious past who was sent by Anton Sokolov, the genius scientist Corvo kidnapped and then befriended during the events of Dishonored 1 to warn Corvo and Emily about the coup. And so they sail to Karnaka, Corvo's hometown and where Delilah planned the coup. They're going there to figure out a way to defeat Delilah and undishonor everyone involved. And that's about it. Dishonored 2's plot received some flack at release, with most of the criticism directed at using the DLC lady as the villain. While I agree the sequel needed a new villain to keep things fresh, it doesn't really bother me that much, to be honest. The plot has never been this series' strong suit. Dishonored's strengths lie in its side quests, characters, art, world, the environmental storytelling, and the emergent micro-stories that occur while playing. The main story, for me at least, has always been just an excuse to change the scenery and do some hot immersive sim shit.
Whoa! What was that? What's going on here? Did you hear that? Nothing here? Let's have a look around. Wonder what I'm dealing with.
But what Dishonored 2 lacks in the plot department, it makes up for in world building and direction. Karnaka is an absolutely stunning location, both visually and design-wise. Now, to understand what makes Karnaka such a great setting, we have to explore its origins from a development standpoint. The first thing to note is Sébastien Mitton's, art director of the first game, returning to Dishonored 2. Victor Antonov, who helped conceive Dishonored's painterly look, moved to a new position within Bethesda, so he was less involved in the sequel. Antonov's role was purely consultative. Now, Mitton and Antonov are some of the most talented artists working in the industry at the moment, and it's safe to say that they played a crucial role in developing Dishonored's identity, both artistic and brand-wise. Without their talent and eye for good design, there would not be a steampunk with painterly visuals game to speak of. Notably, and I'm sorry for the tangent, Antonov infused Dunwall's architecture with elements from Half-Life 2's CT-17, which he designed. That's why Dunwall, an aggressively Victorian steampunk city, has these tinges of neoclassicism and Soviet modernism. With Dishonored 2, Arkane wanted to move away from Dunwall and show a new, sunnier corner of the Empire, while preserving the original's themes.
There's no major change in sensibility of these two games. Dishonored 2 I wanted to be, visually, a journey to a new city. We kept some pillars: oppression, disease, magic, and decay.
Arkane spent about a year laying the foundations of Karnaka's early history. The studio started with developing a rough outline of the setting. Harvey Smith and lead narrative designer Sasha Doval wrote a timeline that went back 4,000 years in history. That might sound excessive, but it helped the designers and artists create a city that looked like it changed and evolved organically within the universe over the years. Creating that monstrous timeline also allowed Arkane to get ideas from inside the game. In other words, while Dunwall was inspired from ideas drawn from the outside world, Arkane looked at the world of Dishonored when designing spaces. What struck me while researching this video was a line from an interview about Arkane trying to avoid the Deus Ex effect, like placing man-sized vents in places that didn't make sense. The spaces, both outdoor and indoor, had to be functional, realistic, and reflect the practicalities of day-to-day life. You notice these little touches everywhere. Karnaka is noticeably Mediterranean in inspiration, and the spaces, architecture, and urban planning reflect that. Karnaka apartments are often spacious, with their windows and ceilings raised to let air flow through. Some apartments, mostly in the affluent parts of Karnaka, even have rudimentary air conditioning units, something you'd never see in the damp and cold climate of Dunwall. But it couldn't have created these realistic spaces solely by looking at the fiction, right? The designers had to draw from experience in some capacity. This interview was very illuminating in terms of how the designers look to real cities when designing the small touches that make a city, well, a city. While residing in Lyon, Harvey Smith lived in a 300-year-old building. The only way to get from one side of the building to the other was to exit the building, walk down the block, and enter from the other side.
It used to kill the silk workers to have to carry stuff down, so they cut crazy paths inside the buildings, Smith said. You can enter this passage, go into a weird courtyard, and then there will be stairs that swing up and out the other side of the building.
These passages are called, and excuse my pronunciation, Traboul, and you can actually see some versions of them in-game. I am 90% sure Arkane's decision to include these trabouls in-game was not coincidental, as labyrinthine interconnected spaces are a staple of immersive sims. In the same interview, Harvey Smith compares how American and European cities are built.
American cities are so different, and American culture is so different. Smith said. You don't see it at first. On the surface, a city is a city, and there are common touches. That's why it's deceptive. When you build an American city, you build in wood because that's what you have. Then things grew so fast over 200 years. We went from the wagon to the space shuttle. It makes more sense to tear a building down than build something new. Hell, tear them all down and widen the street. That's the way we built everything.
However, the French built in stone, which causes a lot of complications and frustrations for modern people.
I live in an apartment in downtown Lyon that's been around for 300 years. That means that the width of the street is the width of the street. Period. One guy will pull his truck up, stop to make a delivery, and everyone honks at him. It drives me nuts because it's so inefficient. But what would you do? Tear down a 500-year-old building?
Now, thinking about the width of fictional streets is not the sexiest of creative activities, but it's why Arkane's worlds feel so authentic and instinctively navigable without minimaps and other UI builds and whistles. You know what? I'm leaving that in. This is like the 15th fucking take. Obviously, this trivia, most of which I hadn't been aware of until researching this video, doesn't even scratch the surface. I haven't even touched on the lush interior decorations, the fashion, the technology. Dishonored 2's use of Art Nouveau is a video on its own. I wouldn't feel like myself if I didn't touch on Dishonored 2's propaganda and branding, so let's talk a bit about that, as unsurprisingly they tie in with the game's themes and narrative. So the first thing you need to know is that despite its sovereign, laid-back vibe, Karnaka is actually a hive of corruption and dysfunction led by the equally corrupt Duke Luca Abel. Duke Luca Abel is the archetype of the cruel clown tyrant who has somehow managed to stay in power despite his crass incompetence. He abuses his power for his own comfort while leaving his subjects to suffer in abject poverty. Also, there's a bloodfly epidemic in Karnaka that he couldn't care less about. The city and the region of Serkonos as a whole has fallen into noticeable ruin under his poor leadership. As you can imagine, Karnaka's culture in general and its political climate in particular inform the propaganda's aesthetic sensibilities and messaging. The Lord Regent's propaganda in Dishonored had a more direct militaristic approach. Now, in keeping with the Duke's personality, he prints huge, expensive, ornate posters filled with empty promises, announcing grand projects that will never happen, meant to distract citizens from the reality of the situation. While Dunwall's propaganda had, for better or worse, a clear, consistent vision, like you could tell it's engineered by skilled propagandists and politicians working towards the goal of preserving Dunwall's dictatorship, the Duke's propaganda is reflective of his unique style of leadership. Basically, he rules by vibe. The propaganda is more colorful, but it lacks consistency.
Propaganda is used to obtain power and to consolidate it. In Dishonored 2, we are dealing with a tyrant more than a dictator, so propaganda comes and goes depending on the Duke's feelings at the time. It's more colorful, less basic than the Lord Regent's, and has more of a southern feel.
Thing is, Duke Luca Abel is not the only major figure shaping Karnaka. Enter Paolo, the allegedly immortal mob boss of the Howlers gang. Played by Pedro Pascal, by the way. This creates an interesting dynamic because while Paolo promotes himself as the solution to Karnaka's problems, he's just a different flavor of tyrant.
They don't see themselves as a gang per se, says Smith. Paolo sees himself as a man of the people. The Duke is corrupt, the Grand Guard is corrupt, the overseers are tyrannical, but he feels like he's the true spirit of Karnaka. He grew up here. He eats the food, he's a man of the people, and he wants to return Karnaka to the way it should be. He sees himself justified in the same way members of the Russian mafia or criminals of any stripe often see themselves.
So far, we've talked about how Arkane designed Karnaka's architecture and the logic behind its urban spatial structures. After that, it was up to Arkane's narrative and art teams to convert these spaces that the designers so lovingly created with personality and narrative context. Connective tissue, if you will, and other fancy words. Arkane have made a name for themselves as world-building mavericks simply because no one else does world-building as skillfully as them. First, there's the literally industrial quantity of reading material found in Dishonored 2. There's nothing revolutionary in a game having reading material by itself. After all, it's a simple and effective way to present lore and the final details of the world. But in Dishonored 2, Arcane thought not only about the contents of its in-game literature, but also format and placement. You got your serialized books, like this one chronicling Sokolov's expedition in Pandysia, a mysterious continent filled with terrible diseases and dangerous fauna, news articles covering the political landscape of Karnaka and Dunwall, notes and letters shining a light on day-to-day life in Karnaka, how its citizens cope with the death and corruption plaguing the city. Here's a few examples. I found this unsent letter written by a man who had something of an unhealthy obsession with Doubt, the Empress's assassin. He didn't get to mail it to his fellow Doubt fan because, he got a case of the bloodfly disease. I felt it was a clever way to connect Dishonored 1 and 2. I also found a letter on a lady that was about to rob a black market shop, which is a gameplay mechanic by the way. The letter was from her sister. Basically, the robber left the kids with her sister to pursue a life of crime, and her sister wasn't having any of that shit anymore. It's a cool touch that humanizes this character a bit and doubles as an introduction to this mechanic. I was exploring an apartment block when I stumbled across a note on an apartment door that's part of an optional mini-story involving two women, Petronila Witherspoon, the owner of the apartment, and Ali, a member of the Howlers gang in Karnaka. Even calling it a mini-story would be a stretch, it's just a micro-event. In the note, Petronila tells Ali she is always welcome to crash at her apartment as long as she takes off her boots when she is sleeping because her boots were always muddy. Petronila even trusted Ali enough to give her the key to her apartment. While Petronila is absent from the game, Ali herself can be seen hanging out in a nearby alleyway with a fellow Howler. If certain conditions are met, she mentions helping out an old lady who was extorted by a Grand Guard by dropping a brick on his head. Ever since that Looney Tunes moment, Petronila has invited Ali in and cooked lunch for her once a week. Pretty wholesome until you hear Ali saying the old lady has some nice stuff, the implication being that she plans to steal the old lady's belongings at a later date. Up until that point, I had adopted a mostly stealthy, non-lethal playstyle, but this potential betrayal made me so angry that I struck both Ali and her piece of shit friend down. I acted on impulse. I had a quick flash forward of that old lady coming home and seeing her apartment trashed and emptied out, and my gut reaction was to kill Ali and prevent that from ever happening. That a simple note pinned on an apartment door followed by an optional NPC conversation riled me up to the point that I abandoned my playstyle and killed these two NPCs is a testament to Dishonored 2's, I don't know, writing, design. It's a bit of everything. The reason why I chose to talk about these optional events instead of doing my usual spiel and covering Dishonored 2's macro world is because it's in these small moments that Dishonored 2's world shines. I could spend 10 pages covering the Abbey of the Everyman, the abusive, highly corrupt de facto seat of religious power in the Empire, the bloodfly epidemic, and so on, but what good would that do? Arcane's attention to the minutiae of their worlds is all the more remarkable when considering the fact that everything, be it gameplay mechanics, items, interactions, objects, don't exist in a vacuum, as in these things have trackable histories in the game world. One example that blew me away involves the saves. I barely think about saves in games. A save is just a thing I input 0451 into before I inevitably fail and begrudgingly start looking for the right code. Anyways, these saves are made by a company, the Wilson Save Company, and this company has multiple visitable shops in the game because of course it's a franchise and of course somebody has to make these saves. Oh, and also, one of these shops hosts a safe cracking contest that nobody is supposed to win because it's a marketing stunt orchestrated to demonstrate how safe their safes are. This video wouldn't feel right without a discussion about Dishonored 2's presentation and artistic merits. Arcane have demonstrated a talent to create interesting looking worlds as early as Arx Fatalis, their debut title, and they've outdone themselves with each subsequent project. Dishonored 2 runs on Arcane's Void Engine as opposed to the original's Unreal Engine 3. Interestingly, the Void Engine is based on a heavily modified version of the id Tech 5. According to Sébastien Mitton, the Void Engine uses about about 20% of id Tech 5. The rest of the code was rewritten to remove unnecessary features such as minimaps and, crucially, to support larger, denser maps. I assume the huge maps from Dishonored's DLC pushed Unreal Engine 3 to its absolute limits, and Arcane realized Dishonored 2 needed new technology. The Void Engine is a strong, if unreliable, piece of technology. While performance is miles better than it was at launch, 7 years later Dishonored 2 is still capable of bringing modern systems to their knees. No way you're running this on Ultra on a mid-range system. So I recommend putting the settings on low, then tweaking one setting at a time. Still, I found that it looks beautiful even on low to medium settings because Dishonored 2 is more about artistic direction than graphics. Karnaka's interiors and exteriors are a visual treat, filled to the brim with skillfully and lovingly crafted details of all kinds. Dishonored 2 is the very definition of dense, which is why the world feels bigger than it actually is. A visit to a random Karnakan apartment is enough to illustrate the kind of denseness of detail Dishonored 2 goes for. They're not glorified storage rooms for props and assets, they look and feel like people actually live in them. A standout level in terms of denseness, in my opinion, is the Addermeyer Institute, a former solarium converted into a research facility for infectious diseases. During the events of Dishonored 2, the Duke has ordered the institute closed for story reasons, causing the facility to fall in disrepair. As an admirer and self-proclaimed urban decay aficionado, I have to confess that I was absolutely shocked by the level of decay I saw in this facility. But, Arcane being Arcane, they made even this rotten, putrid piece of shit of a building look beautiful. I can't quite put my finger on it. It's something about how the shadows cast by the afternoon sun in the interiors give the location an air of mystery, of melancholia. It's a great level and a great showcase of Dishonored 2's Art Nouveau style. Speaking of style, I am happy to report that characters have the same caricatured stylized design from the original. It wouldn't be Dishonored if characters didn't have those huge freaking hands. Anyway, let's talk gameplay.
This is my payment for having to wade through so much shit lately.
Stripped to its core, Dishonored 2 is a first-person action adventure / stealth game. If that sentence strikes you as incredibly basic, it's probably because you know that description is not exactly representative of Dishonored 2. Before we talk general mechanics, let's take a look at the two new major features Dishonored 2 introduced. So the first major change to cross off our list is the introduction of two playable characters. After playing as Emily Coldwind during the prologue, players may decide to play as either Emily or Corvo. I chose Corvo mainly because they brought Steven Russell of Thief fame to voice him. Look, I love Garrett's voice, I can't help it. So all my gameplay takes from here on out will obviously be Corvo-centric. While Corvo and Emily have their own suite of unique powers that drastically affect how you play the game and approach objectives, the narrative differences are minimal, often in the realm of you get a different dialogue line here and there. If my decision to play as Corvo and ignore Emily makes for a less complete video, so be it. The second major feature introduced in Dishonored 2 is the option to outright reject the outsider's mark. This means no blinking and no hot steampunk supernatural assassin shit. All you get is tools, weapons and bone charms. I haven't done a complete flesh and steel playthrough, but from what I played, I can confirm that Dishonored 2 is perfectly playable without powers. I wouldn't recommend it to newcomers though. Anyways, I can't imagine the work it must have taken to balance the game around the flesh and steel mode. Designing levels for a game that lets you teleport all over the place is hard enough. Now imagine designing a mode that strips all your cool powers away in a game that's all about cool powers and making it fun. Where was I? Oh yeah, general mechanics. So, as I said before, Dishonored 2 is a first-person action game with stealth elements. The game has a mission-based structure. You're dropped in a location and work your way towards the goal by any means necessary, whether violent, non-lethal, or any combination thereof. It's really up to you. Both Emily and Corvo wield a pistol, crossbow, a retractable blade, mines, and grenades, all of which are upgradable at black market shops. The kicker is that the gadget offerings are more granular than you may realize at first. The first game was rightfully criticized for its lack of non-lethal gadgets. Dishonored 2 addresses this with the introduction of stun mines, howling bolts that affect target sight and hearing, and stinging bolts that cause targets to flee their current location in agonizing pain before resuming their previous post. The old sleep darts also make a return. Bolts, like many gadgets in this game, can be upgraded and made more efficient. For example, basic sleep darts knock out targets instantaneously only when aimed at the head. When upgraded, sleep darts knock out out enemies no matter what, even when you're spotted. Dishonored 2 also introduces new non-lethal combat moves. Now, you can put your target in a chokehold even when engaged in combat if you parry them just right. Also worth noting are the aerial non-lethal takedowns, which look cool as heck. So there's almost always a handy non-lethal solution and you can finish the game without hurting a single soul. However, no-kill runs are less attainable in Dishonored 2 because the stealth in general is more challenging thanks to the improvements made to artificial intelligence. You may remember that Dishonored 1 was criticized for having brain-dead AI. The criticism was a bit unfair in my opinion. I can't track down the source, but I swear I read somewhere that during development, Arcane realized that the AI they developed was so vigilant that it made the game impossible to play, so they decided to dumb it down. Whether they pitched AI difficulty a little too low in Dishonored 1 is up for debate. Personally, I thought it was fine. Anyways, Arcane listened to the feedback and worked to improve the AI, and with great success. Enemies in general are more aware of their surroundings. Things that go unnoticed in other stealth games are immediately spotted by guards in Dishonored 2. For example, guards notice if their patrol buddies disappear, and instead of shrugging off their absence, they'll start investigating. Guards also notice doors and windows that have been opened or closed, walls of light that have been deactivated, and even missing items. Enemies are more sensitive to noise, which can work both to your advantage and disadvantage. Guards also possess excellent peripheral vision, quite revolutionary as far as stealth games are concerned. But vigilant enemies are not enough to carry a stealth game. After all, the game must provide a good reason for avoiding enemies. Well, let me tell you, when push comes to shove, these choffers will destroy you. Guards dodge, parry, kick you away, and even throw rocks to keep you off balance. In some missions, guards will be the least of your worries. In a later mission, the Royal Conservatory is taken over by Delilah's witches. Because they can blink from place to place, their behavior is harder to predict. You'll often pounce at a witch to choke her thinking you're hidden, only for another witch to suddenly blink to your location and detect you. And don't even get me started on the Clockwork soldiers, these general grievous looking pieces of junk. They're fun to fight though. All it takes are 2 consecutive lovingly and skillfully animated drop assassinations to take them out. So with the AI improved and my usual tricks countered by clever level design, I found myself peeking through keyholes more often than I'd like to admit. Obviously, it wouldn't be Dishonored without powers. Well, I literally just said that it could be because you have the option to refuse them, but you get the idea. Before we talk about the powers, please be aware that I haven't exactly experimented with the offensive ones, as I tried my best to play non-lethally. I'm also in no position to discuss Emily's arsenal of powers because, again, I did a Corvo run for this video. Anyways, Corvo retains the majority of the powers in the first game, though conveniently reset by Delilah, who severed his connection to the Outsider during the coup. Blink, Possession, Wind Blast, Devouring Swarm, Bend Time, Dark Vision, they're all present in Dishonored 2, mostly unchanged barring a few tweaks here and there. Unlike Dishonored, which had a linear upgrading system, in Dishonored 2, the upgrading system has been changed to something akin to a skill tree, with multiple but not mutually exclusive paths to pursue. Similar to Dishonored, powers are upgraded with runes, which are these physical, magical artifacts found in the wild or at black market shops. For example, Blink, the series' emblematic power, has 3 purchasable upgrades. Greater Blink, which extends the range of Blink, Blink Assault, which throws enemies to the ground by attacking as Blink ends, and the star upgrade, Redirective Blink. You may know Redirective Blink as Dowd's own version of Blink from Dishonored's DLC. The way Redirective Blink works is that time stops if you're not moving while aiming Blink. This upgrade combined with Greater Blink and the passive ability that unlocks the ability... Passive ability that unlocks the ability. Can you point me to the idiot that wrote this? Thank you very much. Anyways, Redirective Blink plus Greater Blink plus the ability that makes Corvo jump higher allows you to traverse large swaths of land, and efficiently, because you can basically jump, stop time, assess your surroundings, and blink wherever you want. Another power that you'll want to get is Possession. By default, you can only possess animals such as rats, fish, and hounds. For more elaborate possession shenanigans, you'll have to invest in its 4 available upgrades. Chain Hosts for quickly transitioning between hosts, Corpse Possession for occupying electrifying a recently deceased or knocked out human being, though I haven't gotten much use out of this since I stored bodies out of sight anyways, lasting position, which simply extends its duration, and human position, which is quite self-explanatory. Another favorite of mine is bend time, but I'll save this one for later for a very specific example. All of those powers consume mana, but there are also passive abilities to unlock which do not. More health, more mana, stuff like that. Another staple of the series is the chaos system. The way it worked in the first game is that the level of violence displayed by the player on a mission by mission basis influences the world. For example, massacring everybody, particularly innocent bystanders, and choosing the lethal outcome for the mission's target repeatedly causes an uptick in guards in subsequent missions. Additionally, the plague rat population explodes on account of all the bodies you leave behind, which in turn causes more weepers, these zombie-like creatures, to spawn. While it's a good system overall, critics rightfully pointed out that it punishes combat-centric players and that it doesn't account for nuance in respect to assassination targets, meaning that the chaos value is the same regardless of how quote-unquote evil the assassination targets are. The chaos system makes a return in Dishonored 2, but with a few tweaks. The mechanical heart randomly generates secrets about the people it's pointed at. Some secrets are positive, some are negative, so if you kill people from the former category, you will increase chaos more than if you chose to kill bad people. Similarly, main mission targets do not net the same amount of chaos if killed, so you have some freedom to choose who to take down and who to spare without fear of punishment. There is also a mission that is entirely independent of the chaos system, but we'll get back to it later. As you can see, Dishonored 2 includes elements from multiple genres into one package. So how do these elements come together and contribute to that immersive sim design I've been hinting at? To answer that question, we need to talk about spaces, but this time from a level design perspective. One of Arcane's goals with this game was to make Dishonored, but bigger and better. The first order of business was to greatly expand the scale of levels, and expand they did. Levels are way bigger. Dishonored 1's levels, while large, mostly boil down to a done-wall city block with all its paths leading more or less to the main objective area. But Dishonored 2 comes with 2-stage levels. This 2-stage mission structure has several benefits. For one, it makes each mission feel like a journey. Secondly, it reinforces this idea of Corvo and Emily being two strangers in a hostile land, far away from their contacts at home. With most main objectives requiring some sort of investigative work, this 2-stage structure where the player has to first gather intel by navigating Karnaka's underbelly before going for the main goal, which is usually in the second part of the level, is thematically appropriate. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, maybe I'm not, I don't know, that's just the way I took it. Thirdly, and most importantly, this 2-stage level design approach gave Arcane some breathing room to design spaces that feel less, gamey. Okay, look. As much as I love Dishonored 1's done-wall design, its spaces felt at times very clearly designed with the player's navigational needs in mind. I don't know if that makes sense, so I'll give you an example. This sewer ditch near Lady Boyle's mansion. Is it a piece of public infrastructure first and a hidden path that obscures the player from the hulking tall boys patrolling the streets and also connects to Lady Boyle's courtyard second, or the other way around? I know this is nitpicky and possibly unfair. I feel like an asshole just by giving this example. Marrying world-building driven level design with player-driven level design must be extremely difficult. Hell, making games is extremely difficult, and yet here I am bitching about other people's work. Dishonored 2 is one of the rare examples of games that manage to strike that balance. Karnaka feels like a living, breathing city whose architectural and urbanistic quirks have developed, here comes that expression again, independent from the player. Balconies that are only reachable by blinking are not placed there simply to offer the player a good vantage point. They're there because something happened in Karnaka that caused this particular apartment block to be closed off to the public. Believe it or not, Arcane's focus on realism makes these spaces not less, but more satisfying to traverse and discover. Because Karnaka feels so much like a real city, you can apply real-world logic when finding your way to wherever you wanna go. Arcane's eye for functional spaces and good design is why Dishonored 2 really feels and plays like a game where the player's imagination and inventiveness are actively encouraged and rewarded. There are so many areas to cover here, so let's start with the basics. First, exploration. I don't think it's a stretch to say that exploration is really Dishonored 2's core mechanic. Exploration is where all of Dishonored 2's gameplay mechanics converge. Exploration is how you find runes through which you unlock and upgrade powers, which in turn open up more gameplay options. It's how you uncover new ways to accomplish objectives, scavenge resources to purchase and upgrade equipment, and so on and so forth. Now, whether exploration is fun depends on the quality of the level design, and as I said earlier, Arcane got that covered. But what truly takes exploration to the next level is Blink, a genius ability that I will praise till the heat death of the universe. The inclusion of Blink, this monster of a tool that allows you to swoop across huge distances in the blink of an eye, gave Arcane the opportunity to plan levels with ridiculous amounts of verticality in mind. As much as I love the Deus Ex series, I'll be the first to admit that exploration is too reliant on man-sized vents that have no rhyme or reason to exist. Mankind Divided addressed this issue, but that's a story for another video. Blink changed the rules of the game in the sense that any environmental prop could be either a hiding spot or the means to access an area. Chandeliers, pipes, rooftops, lampposts, ledges, balconies, signposts, billboards, everything is fair game and easily accessible with Blink. Blink is what allowed Arcane to tuck rewards in the most random of places and embellish levels with hidden areas. Another benefit of Blink is that it eliminates the tedium of crouch walking everywhere. So stealth and fast level traversal are not mutually exclusive. And this is where we finally get into Dishonored 2's immersive simness. To give you just a small example of the kind of hot immersive sim shit that Blink allows, I was trying to break into an apartment, but I hadn't unlocked the ability that let me break wooden reinforced doors. I figured there had to be another way inside. So I went outside, scanned the building, and saw a balcony protruding from the apartment block. Thinking it must have been connected to the apartment I had targeted, I zooped. Is that a word? Okay, I blinked to it, and yeah, I was right. I felt so smart. I felt like I had mastered my environment. Another staple of immersive sims are treasures locked in safes, and a significant part of your exploration efforts are dedicated to hunting the codes. Dishonored 2 shakes things up by randomly generating the codes each playthrough, so instead of relying on memory or, let's be honest, wikis, you'll have to actually seek them out by scanning the environment with your eyeballs. Some come in the form of puzzles, while others are, for the lack of a better expression, diegetically inserted into the levels. One that I particularly enjoyed is located in a law office, where a note left behind by the owner says that the code to the safe is written in the usual place. That usual place being a chalkboard right next to his desk. Remove the bottles and you'll find the code, but with the first digit scribbled over. Dishonored 2's gameplay is based on this idea of mastering your environment and bending the game's rules to your will, on using the tools provided by the game and carving your own path, throwing bottles to distract enemies, possessing guards to bypass security systems, systematically thinning out groups of enemies by freezing time, choking out guards and storing their unconscious bodies out of sight, rigging security systems and turrets, taking control of rats and scurrying your way into places you shouldn't be. Wait, I have one more example. A black market shopkeeper hired me to recover an object called the Rosborough prototype from the Royal Conservatory. It's sitting on a pedestal behind a glass panel. Breaking the glass panel is not an option, as doing so triggers the alarm and locks the object behind some iron shutters. Since I had already cleared the building of enemies and I was too lazy to look for the optimal way, I decided to get a little creative. So I froze time with bend time, broke the glass, entered the display, stole the object and bounced before the shutters fell down. I felt like a master thief. These are the kinds of stunts you can pull in Dishonored 2, many of which I will probably never discover due to my severe lack of creativity. There are honestly so many options to accomplish your goals that my head's spinning just at the mere thought of trying to list them. But let's give it a try anyway. As you may already know at this point, Dishonored and its sequel's design is choice and consequence driven. Nowhere is that philosophy more visible than in its mission design. Every mission's main objective is some variation of handle this person in whichever way you see fit. Of course, this also includes eating them, which is a valid option. You don't have to do it though. However, alternative methods are not easily available, which means that you have to do some legwork to discover them. You can unlock these alternative solutions by doing favors for people, by listening in on NPC conversations, or by simply reading a note left behind in some dusty drawer. There's always more than one way to solve a problem, you just have to take the time and seek it out. In one mission, you have to gain access to an ore baron's manor. Thing is, the door is guarded by a mechanism created by none other than the Duke's resident genius savant, Jendosh. There's another layer of complication to this, in the sense that the manor is contested by two warring factions: the Howlers, the gang I mentioned like 5 years ago, and the Overseers. Oh, and that's like another problem you have to solve, like stopping these people from fighting. So here's what you can do. You can either guess the combination by following the tip provided by a nearby description. You can help one of the factions by getting the body of one of the leaders to the leader of the opposing factions, case in which you're rewarded with the key to Jendosh's lock. Or you can find the combination on a piece of paper hidden in Durante's office above Paulo's bar. However, Durante's office is locked and the key is in Vice Overseer Burns' possession. Steal the key, take the note, and boom, you gain access to the manor. Plus, you get to interact with both factions and stay neutral. Pretty cool. I chose this mission specifically because it perfectly illustrates Dishonored 2's design philosophy. It's also worth mentioning that whether you choose to get involved in the war or decide to remain neutral affects the ending, and has other small effects on the world. This would be the perfect opportunity to discuss Dishonored 2's ridiculous reactivity, but this video is already very long as it is, so just take my word for it. It's very reactive. Your choices have consequences, both big and small. Yes, its reactivity is mostly linked to the chaos system, but there are tons of reactive bits that emerge based on things you did outside of the chaos system. Beggars, for example, offer mission-relevant intel for a small fee. Now, if you succumb to the hoarder impulses that Dishonored 2 nurtures through the sheer abundance of stuff to pick up and steal from people, the beggar will refuse to assist you. It makes sense in hindsight, but damn me if it didn't catch me by surprise the first time it happened. Before we wrap up, I want to briefly touch on one standout level: the Clockwork Mansion. I know, you're wondering where a crack in the slab is. The mission that provides you with a device that allows you to seamlessly travel between two timelines and witness Rames's mansion both at its peak and its current decrepit state. I'm saving it for a future video, don't you worry about that. The Clockwork Mansion is probably the best mission in the game. For the past 7 years, the Clockwork Mansion has been the subject of numerous videos and articles dissecting what makes it click, and for good reason. But first, a bit of background. The Clockwork Mansion is the home of Jendosh, a genius inventor and Renaissance man who participated in Delilah's coup. Since Jendosh invented the clockwork soldiers I mentioned earlier, your mission is to eliminate him and thus cut off the supply of clockwork soldiers. The level opens up with Corvo/Emily making their way to the mansion through the streets of Karnaka, which is a mission on its own since they have to figure out how to get there in the first place. Anyways, upon walking through the front door, you're met with a large, unassuming antechamber and a solitary lever. With nothing else to do, you pull the lever. Then everything changes. Literally. Chunks of your surroundings shift in bizarre configurations until they finally coalesce into a different room like some sort of mechanical Frankenstein. The mansion is in reality a monument to Jendosh's genius and, more crucially, his madness. A mansion literally constructed of clockwork, whose configuration and layout can be changed by the simple pull of a lever. Arcane used this gimmick to map out paths through the level and to great effect. Navigating the mansion efficiently is not simply a matter of pulling levers, as the logic behind the changing layouts can seem arbitrary on a first playthrough. I had a lot of trouble orienting myself in this maze, which I guess was the point. You're literally navigating through the mind of a psychopathic genius. Adding to the nightmarish maze-like feeling of the mansion is the fact that Jendosh is closely following your actions and taunting you. With every layer of the mansion's nightmarish mechanisms you peel off, Jendosh congratulates you with the sarcastic affectation of a puppet master witnessing their plaything overcoming obstacles that they fought and in their arrogance still think are insurmountable. Because that's what you are to Jendosh, a bug to be squashed, a toy to be discarded as soon as its usefulness has run out. And I think this psychological layer is a genius touch, because you feel all the more incentivized to outsmart this sick fuck and prove once and for all that the world doesn't revolve around him. It's also a great incentive to explore and understand how the mechanisms operating the mansion work. Inquisitive players will notice that in certain areas, it's possible to slip through the cracks of the floor mid-transformation. This grants the player a literal peek under the hood. Those shifting and rotating rooms are not part of some elaborate smoke and mirrors trick. There's an actual network of mechanisms and shit inside the building. Coincidentally, there's an achievement for taking out Jindosh without alerting him to your presence. And the only way to do that is by not pulling levers and sticking to this in-between space where the guts powering Jindosh's gruesome invention reside. No wonder this level had its own director. Saving and extracting Sokolov, because the creepy nerd had to also kidnap your best friend and mentor, leaves the protagonist with the choice of what to do with Jindosh. Either kill him or find a non-lethal way to knock him out of the game. Throughout my adventure, I got intimately familiar with Jindosh as a person. He abuses his employees, actively schemes to sabotage the careers of his peers. According to the Heart, he dissected a cat as a child. I also found that he's under immense pressure by the Duke to make his beloved Clockwork soldiers cost efficient, as the current model is not scalable. What if I found a way to strip him of the thing he holds most dear? His intellect. Thankfully, Jindosh had alluded to the existence of an electroshock chair in some notes, an electroshock chair that he used on my friend Sokolov. So I knocked Jindosh out, strapped him to the chair, and zapped his brains. Taste of his own medicine. The Clockwork Mansion is a genius bit of level design and the absolute peak of Dishonored 2. I wish I had a more eloquent way to express this, but there you go. The Clockwork Mansion is basically a microcosm of everything that makes Dishonored 2 such a great game. Genius level design, immersive, choice-rich and agency-driven gameplay, and great world building. I love this level and I love this game, and I hope I did Dishonored 2 justice with this video. Thanks for watching. As always, a huge thank you to my wonderful patrons whose generosity makes these videos possible. I'll see you next time.